Undercover billionaire orders coffee. Black waitress secretly slips him a note that stops him cold. The ceramic cup trembled against the saucer as Thomas Mitchell read the 5 words scrawled on the napkin beneath it. "They're coming for you. Run." The fluorescent lights of Mel's diner cast harsh shadows across Thomas Mitchell's weathered hands as he adjusted the collar of his thrift store flannel shirt. 3 months of living as Tom, a down-on-his-luck construction worker, had taught him that authenticity lay in the details. The dirt under his fingernails, the worn steel-toed boots, the way he counted quarters before ordering coffee. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the familiar weight of his disguise felt like a shroud. If you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe, like this video and comment what time it is that you're watching this video. Now let's get back to the story. The bell above the diner door chimed as another late-night customer shuffled in from the October cold. Tom, kept his eyes on the laminated menu he'd memorized weeks ago, though his peripheral vision tracked every movement in the restaurant's reflection on the rain-streaked window. Old habits died hard, even when you were pretending to be poor. Welcome to Victory Stories. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more powerful life lessons, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. Behind the counter, Keisha Williams moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd been serving coffee and dreams to strangers for longer than she cared to remember. At 28, she possessed a quiet strength that seemed to emanate from her dark eyes, and a smile that could warm the coldest night, though she rarely had reason to use it anymore. She'd noticed Tom the first night he'd wandered in, 3 months ago, soaked from an October storm and looking like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. There was something about him that didn't quite fit, the way he observed people, the careful way he spoke, as if every word was measured and weighed. But in a place like Riverside, Illinois, everyone had secrets. Everyone was running from something. The diner occupied that liminal space between hope and desperation, where shift workers grabbed coffee before heading to factories that barely paid enough to cover rent, where single mothers counted change for their children's meals, where dreams came to die slow, caffeinated deaths. It was the perfect place for a man like Thomas Mitchell to disappear, to become invisible among the invisible. What do you think drives someone to completely abandon their identity? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. But Thomas wasn't just hiding from his past, he was hunting. For 6 months, he'd been following a trail of financial breadcrumbs that led from the boardrooms of Manhattan to the forgotten corners of America. Someone had been systematically destroying his companies from within, liquidating assets, ruining lives, and covering their tracks with surgical precision. The attacks weren't random, they were personal. Keisha approached his booth with a coffee pot, her reflection catching in the window like a ghost against the night. She developed a routine with Tom over these months, a comfortable dance of service and solitude. He always ordered the same thing, black coffee, no sugar, and a slice of apple pie if it was fresh. He always left exact change plus a modest tip. He never caused trouble, never tried to flirt, never looked at her like she was part of the scenery. "Refill?" she asked, though she was already pouring. Tom nodded, studying her face in the dim light. There were dark circles under her eyes, and a tension in her shoulders that spoke of burdens beyond the physical demands of waitressing. He'd wondered about her story, everyone who ended up at Mel's had one, but he'd been too focused on his own mission to truly see her. That was about to change. As Keisha set the cup down, her hand brushed against his for just a moment, skin against skin, warmth against warmth. But it was what she left beneath the saucer that sent ice through his veins. The napkin was folded small, innocent-looking among the sugar packets and worn laminate. But when Thomas unfolded it, 5 words written in careful block letters stopped his heart. "They're coming for you. Run." His hand instinctively moved toward the phone in his pocket, but Keisha's voice, barely above a whisper, froze him in place. "Don't react. Don't look at me. Just listen." Thomas forced himself to take a sip of coffee, though it tasted like ash in his mouth. Around them, The diner continued its late-night rhythm. The cook scraping the grill, the elderly man in the corner booth slowly working through his soup, the soft jazz from the radio mixing with the hum of the coffee machine. There are 3 men in the parking lot, Keisha continued, wiping down the already clean table next to his black sedan. They've been there for 20 minutes, watching the diner. They showed me your picture an hour ago. The coffee cup rattled against the saucer as Thomas set it down. In 3 months of careful hiding, he'd grown complacent. He'd let his guard down in this small Illinois town, seduced by the illusion of anonymity. "Did you?" he started to whisper. "I told them I'd never seen you before." Keisha's voice carried a steel he hadn't expected. "But Tom, or whoever you really are," they weren't asking. They were confirming. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed life crashing down around him. Whoever had been hunting him had found him, and now an innocent woman was caught in the crossfire. "There's a back exit through the kitchen," Keisha continued, her voice steady despite the danger. "Miguel doesn't ask questions. You can slip out through the alley, but you'll need to move now." "Why are you helping me?" The question escaped before Thomas could stop it. For the first time since delivering the note, Keisha looked directly at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten, not fear but recognition. The look of someone who understood what it meant to run, to hide, to reinvent yourself out of necessity. "Because," she said simply, "we all deserve a second chance." The door chimed again, and Thomas felt his blood freeze. 2 men in expensive suits had entered, their eyes scanning the diner with professional efficiency. They moved with the controlled grace of predators, and Thomas knew immediately they weren't here for coffee. "Kitchen. Now," Keisha whispered, but Thomas was already moving, leaving his coffee cup half full and the napkin hidden in his palm. As he stood, one of the men looked directly at him, and Thomas saw the moment of recognition flash across his face. The hunt was over. The running was about to begin again. But as Thomas Mitchell walked toward his uncertain future, one thought echoed in his mind. Why would a small-town waitress risk everything to save a stranger? The answer to that question would change both their lives forever. The kitchen of Mel's diner smelled of grease, onions, and desperation. Miguel Hernandez looked up from the grill as Thomas burst through the swinging doors, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Back door," Thomas said simply, and Miguel, who'd spent enough time in border towns to recognize urgency, jerked his head toward the rear exit without a word. But as Thomas's hand touched the metal door handle, he heard Keisha's voice rise in the dining room, artificially bright and welcoming. "Good evening, gentlemen. Coffee?" Through the small window in the kitchen door, Thomas could see her approaching the 2 men, coffee pot in hand, her posture perfectly composed despite the danger. The taller man, pale with steel-gray hair, showed her something, a photograph, and Thomas watched her face perform a masterpiece of confused innocence. "I'm sorry, I don't recognize him," she said, her voice carrying just far enough for Thomas to hear. "We get a lot of travelers through here. You might try the motel down the road." The shorter man, darker and built like a boxer, leaned forward. "Ma'am, we have reason to believe this individual has been frequenting this establishment. Our information is very reliable." Thomas knew he should run. Every instinct honed by years of corporate warfare and 6 months of hiding screamed at him to disappear into the night. But something about the way Keisha held herself, the slight tremor in her voice that only he seemed to notice, kept his feet planted on the greasy kitchen floor. She was scared. And she was protecting him anyway. Have you ever had someone risk everything for you, even when they barely knew you? Share your story in the comments below. "Well," Keisha said, setting the coffee pot down with deliberate care, "like I said, I haven't seen him. But you're welcome to look around if you want. Miguel, these gentlemen want to check the kitchen." It was a warning wrapped in cooperation, and Thomas finally understood. She wasn't just buying him time, she was giving him a choice. Run and leave her to face whatever consequences came, or stand and face this together. For a man who'd spent 15 years building a business empire worth $3 billion, the choice should have been simple: Self-preservation had always been his guiding principle. But as he watched this woman, this stranger who knew nothing about his wealth or power, put herself at risk for him, something shifted in Thomas Mitchell's carefully ordered world. He stepped back from the door. The kitchen door swung open, and the two men entered with Miguel trailing behind, his hands raised in a gesture of cooperation. The taller man's eyes swept the kitchen professionally before settling on Thomas, who stood beside the prep station with a dish towel in his hands, as if he'd been drying plates. "Well, well," the man said, his voice carrying the flat vowels of Chicago. "Tom the construction worker, I presume?" Thomas straightened, letting the towel fall to the floor. The game was over, but he wouldn't go quietly. "I think you gentlemen have me confused with someone else." The shorter man laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender. "Thomas Jonathan Mitchell, age 43, CEO of Mitchell Enterprises, net worth approximately $3.2 billion. Born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Lost your parents in a car accident when you were 16. No siblings. No wife. No children." He paused, tilting his head. "Should I continue?" The recitation of his life hit Thomas like physical blows. But it was what the man didn't say that chilled him. No mention of why he was hiding, no acknowledgement of the conspiracy that had driven him underground. These men weren't here to expose his investigation. They were here to end it. "I'm afraid you really do have the wrong person," Thomas said calmly. "I'm just a guy looking for work. Been helping out in the kitchen here for a few weeks." Through the door window, he could see Keisha still standing by the booth where he'd been sitting, her dark eyes fixed on the kitchen doors. Their gazes met across the glass, and he saw her slight nod, an acknowledgement, perhaps, or an absolution. "Mr. Mitchell," the gray-haired man said, pulling a phone from his jacket, "we can do this easy, or we can do this hard. My employer is very eager to speak with you about certain discoveries you may have made regarding your company's recent difficulties." So they knew. Thomas felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. 6 months of careful investigation, of following paper trails and shell companies, of sleeping in flea-bag motels and eating gas station sandwiches, it had all been worth it. He'd been close enough to the truth to scare them into the open. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, "but I really don't know what you're talking about." The shorter man sighed and reached inside his jacket. The motion was smooth, practiced, and Thomas recognized the shape of a shoulder holster beneath the expensive suit. But before the man could draw whatever weapon he carried, the kitchen door burst open, and Keisha stormed in, her face flushed with perfectly manufactured indignation. "Excuse me, but what is going on in my kitchen?" she demanded, hands on her hips. "Miguel, did you give these men permission to harass our employees?" The two men looked at her with the dismissive annoyance of professionals dealing with an unexpected complication. The taller man started to speak, but Keisha cut him off. "Because if you're not health inspectors or police officers with a warrant, you need to get out of my workspace. We've got health codes to follow here." "Ma'am," the gray-haired man said with forced patience, "this doesn't concern you." "The hell it doesn't," Keisha shot back, moving to stand beside Thomas. "This is my place of work, and Tom here is my friend. So if you want to continue this conversation, you can do it out in the dining room where I can see what's happening." Thomas stared at her in amazement. She was magnificent, a force of nature wrapped in a waitress uniform, standing up to dangerous men with nothing but righteous anger and stubborn courage. In 15 years of boardroom battles, he'd never seen such fearless determination. The shorter man's hand moved again toward his jacket, but his partner stopped him with a look. "Of course," the gray-haired man said smoothly. "We don't want to cause any trouble. Mr. Tom, was it? Perhaps we could continue our conversation outside." It wasn't a request. Thomas looked at Keisha, who was watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes. In them, he saw something that made his decision for him, not fear but trust. She was trusting him to handle this, to protect her from the consequences of her courage. "Sure," Thomas said. But I think there's been some kind of mistake. As they moved toward the dining room, Keisha caught his arm, her fingers warm against his skin through the flannel shirt. "Be careful," she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. And in that moment, as Thomas Mitchell walked toward an uncertain fate, he realized that somewhere in the space between her warning note and her fierce protection, everything had changed. This wasn't just about his investigation anymore, or his company, or even his life. This was about a woman who'd shown him what courage looked like, and he'd be damned if he'd let anything happen to her because of his choices. The night was about to get much more dangerous. But for the first time in months, Thomas Mitchell wasn't running alone. The dining room felt different now, smaller, more confined, as if the presence of these two men had sucked the oxygen from the space. The elderly customer in the corner booth had vanished, leaving behind only a half-eaten bowl of soup and a crumpled napkin. Even the cook had disappeared into whatever hidey-hole people like Miguel used when trouble walked through the door. Thomas sat in his original booth, facing the two men across the worn Formica table. Keisha had positioned herself behind the counter, close enough to hear but far enough away to maintain the pretense that this was just a conversation between strangers. "Now then," the gray-haired man said, settling his expensive suit against the cracked vinyl seat, "shall we drop the charade? You've been very difficult to find, Mr. Mitchell. I keep telling you. Please." The man held up a manicured hand. "We know about the bank account you opened in Springfield under the name Thomas Wilson. We know about the motel in Peoria where you stayed for 3 weeks in September. We know about the private investigator you hired in Chicago, former detective named Patricia Voss. Should I continue?" Each revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. They'd been tracking him for months, following his trail with surgical precision. But how? He'd been so careful, so methodical in covering his tracks. "I'm impressed," Thomas said, abandoning the pretense. "Though I have to ask, how long have you been watching me?" The shorter man smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. "Long enough to know you've been asking the wrong questions to the right people." "Or the right questions to the wrong people," his partner added. "Depends on your perspective." From behind the counter, Thomas heard the soft clink of dishes being washed. Keisha, keeping busy but staying close. Her presence was both comforting and terrifying. These men had already demonstrated they knew far too much about his movements. What if they decided she was a liability? "Here's what's going to happen," the gray-haired man continued, pulling out a tablet and sliding it across the table. "You're going to sign this document, transferring your remaining shares in Mitchell Enterprises to a holding company. You're going to liquidate your personal assets and donate the proceeds to charity. We've already selected several worthy causes. And then you're going to disappear." Thomas looked at the screen, his blood running cold. It was all there, legal documents prepared by expensive lawyers, ready for his electronic signature. They'd been planning this for months, maybe years. "And if I refuse?" The shorter man's jacket fell open slightly, revealing the grip of a pistol. "Then we'll be forced to expedite the process." "You can't just murder a billionaire and expect no one to notice," Thomas said, though even as he spoke, he realized how naive the statement sounded. "Oh, but we can," the gray-haired man replied. Thomas Mitchell, distraught over his business failures, disappeared into the American heartland. His body will be found in a few months, victim of a tragic accident. Very sad. Very believable. The tablet screen glowed between them like a portal to hell. With a few electronic signatures, Thomas could erase himself from existence, become truly invisible. It should have been an easy choice: sign the papers, disappear forever, start over with nothing but his life. But his eyes drifted to Keisha, who was now openly watching the conversation, her face a mask of controlled concern. She'd risked everything to warn him, and for what? A stranger in a flannel shirt who ordered black coffee and left modest tips? What would you do if faced with losing everything to protect someone you cared about? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. "I need a moment to think," Thomas said. "You have 30 seconds, the shorter man replied, checking his watch with theatrical precision. In those 30 seconds, Thomas Mitchell's entire life flashed before his eyes. Not the life of board meetings and corporate acquisitions, of private jets and penthouse apartments, but the life of the last 3 months. The quiet conversations with Miguel about his family in El Salvador. The elderly customers who shared stories of grandchildren and lost loves. The way Keisha hummed softly while refilling salt shakers, her voice carrying melodies that seemed to chase away the diner's shadows. For the first time in 43 years, he'd found something that felt like home. And these men wanted to take that away from him, wanted to erase not just his identity but his connections, his newfound understanding of what it meant to be human rather than just successful. "Time's up," the gray-haired man said. Thomas looked at the tablet, then at the two men, then at Keisha. She was watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes, and in them he saw something that made his decision inevitable. She believed in him. Not Thomas Mitchell the billionaire, but Tom the construction worker who dried dishes and left modest tips. She believed he was worth saving, worth risking everything for. Now it was his turn to prove her right. "No," Thomas said simply. The word hung in the air like a challenge. The shorter man's hand moved toward his jacket, but Thomas continued before he could draw his weapon. "But I have a counter-proposal." The shorter man's hand froze halfway to his jacket as Thomas leaned back in the booth, his demeanor shifting from cornered prey to something far more dangerous, a predator who'd finally decided to show his teeth. "You see, gentlemen," Thomas said, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded boardrooms worth billions, "you've made a fundamental error in your approach." The gray-haired man's eyes narrowed. "And what would that be?" "You assumed I've been running because I'm afraid." Thomas smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd built an empire from nothing and wasn't about to let it die in a small-town diner. "But I haven't been running from you. I've been hunting you." He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a small digital recorder. The red light blinked steadily in the dim diner lighting. "Everything you've said in the last 10 minutes has been recorded and automatically uploaded to a secure server," Thomas continued. "Including your threats against my life, your admission of tracking me illegally, and your very interesting revelation about having prepared legal documents to steal my assets." The two men exchanged glances, and Thomas saw the first crack in their professional composure. "Moreover," he pressed on, "I think you'll find that Detective Patricia Voss, the private investigator you mentioned, has been quite busy these past few months. She's uncovered some fascinating connections between your employer and several shell companies that have been systematically sabotaging my businesses." From behind the counter, Keisha watched this transformation with amazement. The man she'd known as Tom, quiet, humble, always counting his change, had become someone else entirely. His posture had straightened, his voice had deepened, and there was a power radiating from him that made the air itself seem to vibrate with potential energy. "You're bluffing," the shorter man said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Thomas pulled out his phone, not the battered flip phone he'd been carrying as Tom, but a sleek smartphone that had been hidden in a secret pocket of his jacket. "Detective Voss, are you there?" The phone's speaker crackled to life. "I'm here, Mr. Mitchell. And I've got everything we need." The gray-haired man's face went ashen. "That's impossible. We've been monitoring all communications." "You've been monitoring Tom's communications," Thomas corrected. "Construction worker, temporary resident, man with nothing to lose. But Thomas Mitchell has resources you can't even imagine. Have you ever seen someone completely transform when backed into a corner? Share your experiences in the comments below." The woman's voice continued from the phone speaker, clear and professional. "Gentlemen, my name is Detective Patricia Voss, Chicago PD, retired. For the past 6 months, I've been investigating financial crimes against Mitchell Enterprises at Mr. Mitchell's request. What you may not know is that this entire conversation has been live-streamed to FBI agents who are currently surrounding this building." As if summoned by her words, red and blue lights began flashing outside the diner windows. The shorter man shot to his feet, his hand moving toward his weapon, but Thomas held up a warning finger. I wouldn't recommend that. Agent Chun is very good at her job, and she doesn't like it when people threaten civilians. Through the window, dark figures in FBI windbreakers were positioning themselves around the building. The cavalry had arrived, but Thomas wasn't finished with his revelations. You want to know what I've really been doing these past 3 months? Thomas asked, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of a chess master announcing checkmate. I've been building a case. Every transaction, every shell company, every illegal stock manipulation, I've got it all. And more importantly, I know who's been pulling the strings. The gray-haired man's phone buzzed. He looked at it, and what little color remained in his face drained away completely. That would be your boss, Thomas said conversationally. Explaining that the operation has been compromised and that you're now, as they say in the business, expendable. But it was what happened next that surprised everyone in the diner, including Thomas himself. Keisha stepped out from behind the counter, moving with purpose toward their booth. In her hand was a small silver object that caught the light as she approached. Keisha, don't, Thomas started, but she was already sliding into the booth beside him, her shoulder brushing against his as she placed something on the table. It was a flash drive. I think this belongs to you, she said quietly. The two men stared at the device as if it were a live grenade. Thomas looked at Keisha with new eyes, seeing not just the waitress who'd served him coffee for 3 months, but someone else entirely. How do you, he began. My name isn't really Keisha Williams, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. It's Keisha Washington. Detective Keisha Washington, Chicago PD Financial Crimes Division. I've been undercover for 8 months, investigating money laundering operations in small Midwest towns. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. All this time, while he'd been playing construction worker, she'd been playing waitress. While he'd been hunting his enemies, she'd been hunting hers. And somehow, their investigations had led them to the same place. The flash drive contains financial records from 3 banks in Springfield, Keisha continued, her professional mask firmly in place. Records that show large cash deposits being filtered through this diner and 17 others just like it across Illinois and Indiana. The gray-haired man lunged for the drive, but Thomas was faster, his hand slamming down on the device as FBI agents burst through the diner's front door. FBI. Everyone down. Chaos erupted in the small space. The shorter man finally drew his weapon, but Agent Chun, a compact Asian-American woman with steel in her eyes, put 2 non-lethal rounds in his chest before he could raise it. The gray-haired man tried to run for the kitchen, but Miguel had apparently decided that cooperation was the better part of valor, blocking the exit with a meat cleaver in each hand. In the middle of it all, Thomas and Keisha sat side by side in the booth, her hand covering his on the flash drive, both of them breathing hard as their carefully constructed worlds collapsed and rebuilt themselves around them. So, Thomas said when the shouting died down and the 2 men were being led away in handcuffs, Detective Washington. So, she replied, Mr. Mitchell. How long have you known? Keisha smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it was completely genuine. About 2 weeks. You're very good at being poor, but you're terrible at hiding your education. Nobody uses words like subsequently when complaining about the weather unless they went to business school. Thomas laughed, a sound that started as a chuckle and built into something approaching hysteria. And I thought I was so clever, hiding in plain sight. You were, Keisha said softly. From them. Just not from me. Agent Chun approached their table, holstering her weapon and pulling out a notepad. Detective Washington, Mr. Mitchell. We need to debrief, but first, are either of you injured? Just my pride, Thomas said, then looked at Keisha with new respect. Though I have to ask, if you're a cop, why didn't you just arrest me? You could have blown my cover weeks ago. Keisha's expression grew serious. Because I realized pretty quickly that you weren't the criminal I was looking for. You were hunting the same people I was, just from a different angle. And because. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. Because whoever you really were, Tom was a good man. He deserved the chance to finish what he started. The weight of her words settled over Thomas like a warm blanket. In a world where everyone wanted something from him, money, influence, access, this woman had protected him simply because she believed he was worth protecting. But even as the immediate danger passed, Thomas knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The two men in custody were foot soldiers, not generals. Somewhere out there, the real architect of the conspiracy against him was watching, planning, adapting. And now they knew about Keisha. As if reading his thoughts, Agent Chen's phone buzzed. She answered it, listened for a moment, then hung up with a grim expression. "We have a problem," she announced. "The holding company these gentlemen mentioned? It just transferred $80 million out of the country. And according to our financial analysts, it's only the beginning. Someone's liquidating everything connected to Mitchell Enterprises, and they're doing it fast." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. While they'd been playing cat and mouse in the diner, his unknown enemy had been executing the final phase of their plan. In a matter of hours, everything he'd built could be gone forever. But worse than that, they now knew about Keisha. And if Thomas had learned anything about his mysterious adversary over the past 6 months, it was that they didn't leave loose ends. "We need to get you both to a safe house," Agent Chun continued. "Tonight. There's no telling how they'll respond to losing their ground team." Thomas looked at Keisha, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her dark eyes. They'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, two people hiding behind false identities in a small-town diner. But now the masks were off, and the real battle was about to begin. "Detective," Thomas said to Agent Chun, "how long do we have before they move the rest of the money?" "Our analysts estimate 6 hours, maybe less." 6 hours to save his life's work. 6 hours to protect the woman who'd risked everything to save him. 6 hours to catch a ghost who'd been hunting him for months. Thomas Mitchell had built an empire in less time. But as he looked at Keisha, Detective Washington, he realized that for the first time in his life, he had something more important than money to fight for. He had someone to fight beside. The FBI safe house was a nondescript ranch home in suburban Chicago, complete with drawn curtains and unmarked surveillance vehicles that tried too hard to look ordinary. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, multiple laptops open before him, his fingers flying across keyboards as he attempted to track the movement of his stolen assets through a labyrinth of offshore accounts. Keisha, he was still adjusting to thinking of her as Detective Washington, stood by the window, coffee cup in hand, watching the street with the practiced eye of someone trained to spot danger. Even in civilian clothes hastily procured by the FBI, she carried herself with an authority that made Thomas wonder how he'd ever believed she was just a waitress. "Talk to me," Agent Chin said, entering the room with a file folder thick enough to stop a bullet. "What are we looking at?" Thomas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. 3 hours of constant work had yielded results, but not the kind he'd hoped for. "It's worse than we thought. They're not just stealing my money, they're using it to destroy other companies. Small businesses, family operations, anything connected to the communities where I've been investing." He turned one of the laptop screens toward them, showing a complex web of financial transactions. "Look at this. Riverside Manufacturing, the plant where half this town works, they're foreclosing on it tomorrow morning. The loan company that's calling it in? Owned by the same shell corporation that's been liquidating my assets." Keisha set down her coffee cup, her face grim. "How many people will lose their jobs?" 1,800, just from that one plant. "But it's not random, Detective. Every target has a connection to me, to places I've visited, people I've helped." Thomas's voice grew bitter. "Someone's been watching my every move for years, cataloging every act of charity, every investment in local communities. They're not just destroying my company, they're destroying everything I've tried to build." Agent Chun studied the screen, her expression thoughtful. This level of surveillance, this depth of planning. We're not talking about a typical corporate takeover. This is personal. But who? Thomas demanded, frustration bleeding into his voice. I've made enemies, sure, but this goes beyond business rivalry. This is systematic, surgical. Someone with resources and patience and... He paused, a terrible thought forming. Someone who knows me well enough to predict my movements. The room fell silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant sound of traffic. Thomas stared at the financial data flowing across his screens, seeing patterns that made his blood run cold. Every move he'd made, every decision he'd taken, it was as if someone had been inside his head, anticipating his choices before he'd made them. Mr. Mitchell, Agent Chen said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Is there anyone in your inner circle, anyone with access to your personal information, who might have reason to want you destroyed? Thomas opened his mouth to say no, then stopped. The patterns on the screen seemed to shift and coalesce into something recognizable, something that made his stomach drop into his shoes. Son of a bitch, he whispered. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely had been working against you all along? Share how it felt in the comments. Keisha moved away from the window, her cop instincts recognizing the change in his demeanor. What is it? Thomas's fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up personnel files, financial records, access logs. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with horrible clarity. Margaret Sinclair, he said, the name tasting like poison in his mouth. My CFO for the past 8 years. She's been with me since the beginning, helped build the company from a $10 million startup to what it is today. He turned the screen again, showing them a photograph of an elegant woman in her 50s, silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, smile polished to corporate perfection. She has access to everything, financial records, investment strategies, my personal calendar. She knows my habits, my preferences, my... He stopped, realization hitting him like a physical blow. She knows about my father. Agent Chen frowned. Your father? I thought your parents died when you were 16. They did. Car accident on I-80, December 23, 2000. Thomas's voice grew quiet, distant. But before he died, my father was investigating something. He was a forensic accountant, worked for the state attorney general's office. He'd stumbled onto a money laundering operation, small-town businesses being used to clean dirty money for organized crime. The silence in the room was deafening. Keisha sat down across from Thomas, her dark eyes fixed on his face. He was killed for it, wasn't he? She said softly. The car accident wasn't an accident. Thomas nodded, unable to speak. It was the truth he'd carried for 23 years. The driving force behind every success, every acquisition, every carefully planned move to build something his father would have been proud of. Margaret knew, he continued when he could trust his voice again. I told her the whole story 5 years ago, during a company retreat. I was drunk, feeling philosophical, and I shared more than I should have. I told her about my father's investigation, about the small-town money laundering network he'd uncovered before he died. Agent Chen was already reaching for her phone. We need to. Wait. Thomas held up a hand, his mind racing. She's not working alone. This operation, the level of coordination required, Margaret's brilliant, but she's not a criminal mastermind. Someone else is pulling the strings. He turned back to the laptops, his fingers flying over the keys as he dove deeper into the financial records. Account numbers, routing codes, shell company registrations, all of it painting a picture that made his blood run cold. Here, he said, pointing to a series of transactions. Look at the timing. Every major move against my company happened within 48 hours of Margaret attending a board meeting or conference. But look at this, she wasn't the only one at those meetings. New files opened on the screen, conference attendance lists, corporate directories, cross-referenced against the financial records. Vincent Morrison, Thomas said, the name coming out like a curse. CEO of Morrison Financial Group. Margaret's been feeding him information, and he's been orchestrating the entire operation. Keisha leaned forward, studying the data. Morrison Financial, they were involved in my money laundering investigation. 17 small businesses across the Midwest, all using the same clearinghouse, all connected back to a parent company owned by Morrison. It's the same network, Thomas realized. The same operation my father was investigating 23 years ago. Morrison's been running a money laundering scheme for decades, using small-town businesses as fronts. When my father got too close, they killed him. And when I started making investments in the same communities, they saw an opportunity. The full scope of the conspiracy was staggering. For years, Vincent Morrison had been watching Thomas rebuild the very communities his network had been exploiting. Every charitable investment, every economic development project, every job created, it was all a threat to Morrison's carefully constructed criminal empire. So he turned my own CFO against me, Thomas continued, pieces falling into place. Probably offered her a fortune to help destroy everything I'd built. And when that wasn't enough, he decided to eliminate me entirely. Agent Chen's phone rang. She answered it, listened for a moment, then hung up with an expression that made Thomas's blood freeze. Morrison's on the move, she announced. Private jet filed a flight plan 20 minutes ago. Destination, a non-extradition country. We have maybe an hour before he's gone forever. And the money? Keisha asked. Still transferring. Our cybercrimes unit estimates he'll have liquidated everything within the next 2 hours. Thomas stared at the screens, watching his life's work disappear one transaction at a time. 1,800 jobs at Riverside Manufacturing. Thousands more at other companies across the Midwest. Small businesses that would never recover, families that would lose their homes, communities that would never be the same. All because he'd tried to honor his father's memory by building something good in a world full of predators. There's something else, Agent Chen continued, her voice grim. We intercepted communications suggesting Morrison has ordered a cleanup operation. He's not just running, he's eliminating witnesses. The implications hit Thomas like a sledgehammer. Margaret Sinclair, who'd betrayed him but was now a liability. The 2 men they'd captured at the diner, who could tie Morrison to attempted murder. And Keisha, Thomas said, his voice tight with fear. He knows about you now. You're a witness to everything that happened tonight. Their eyes met across the table, and Thomas saw his own realization reflected in her dark gaze. Morrison wasn't just stealing his money and destroying his company. He was tying up loose ends, and they were both very loose ends indeed. How long do we have? Thomas asked Agent Chen. Hard to say. Could be hours, could be minutes. Morrison has resources, connections. He could have people moving toward this location already. Thomas looked at the laptops, at the evidence of Morrison's crimes spread across multiple screens. Then he looked at Keisha, this remarkable woman who'd risked everything to protect a stranger, and made a decision that would have horrified the billionaire he'd been 6 months ago. Agent Chen, he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded boardrooms and built empires. I need you to do something that's going to sound completely insane. I'm listening. I need you to let me go. The room erupted in protests, but Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. Morrison thinks I'm dead or captured. He thinks he's won. But what he doesn't know is that Tom the construction worker still has friends in Riverside, people who trust him, people who'll help him. And Vincent Morrison has never dealt with anyone like that before. Thomas stood up, closing the laptops with decisive clicks. I'm not running anymore, he announced. It's time to hunt. But as he looked at Keisha, seeing the fear and determination warring in her expression, Thomas knew that this final confrontation would cost him everything, either his life, or the thing that had somehow become more precious than all his billions combined. The woman who'd shown him what it meant to be human was about to walk into hell beside him. And there was no guarantee either of them would walk back out. The Riverside manufacturing plant looked like a ghost town at 3 in the morning. Security lights cast long shadows across the empty parking lot, illuminating the foreclosure notice signs that had been posted on every entrance. By dawn, 1,800 people would wake up to find their livelihoods had vanished overnight, unless Thomas could stop it. He crouched behind a shipping container with Keisha beside him, both of them wearing tactical gear borrowed from Agent Chen's team. The FBI had reluctantly agreed to his plan, though Thomas suspected it was less about trust and more about having run out of conventional options. "Motion sensors show 4 guards inside," Keisha whispered, checking the tablet that displayed the building's security feed. "But the interesting part is the black sedan parked behind the administrative offices. That's not part of the normal security detail." Thomas studied the feed, his mind working through possibilities. Morrison wouldn't come himself, too risky. But Margaret might be here. She'd want to oversee the final phase personally, make sure there are no loose ends. What would you risk to save the livelihoods of people you've never met? Let us know in the comments below. They moved through the shadows toward the building's rear entrance, their footsteps silent on the asphalt. Thomas felt strange in the tactical gear. For months, he'd been Tom the construction worker, blending into crowds with worn flannel and steel-toed boots. Now he was someone else entirely, not the billionaire CEO, not the undercover investigator, but something new. Something forged in the crucible of the last 6 hours. The rear door's electronic lock took Keisha exactly 47 seconds to bypass, a skill that definitely hadn't been covered in waitressing school. They slipped inside, finding themselves in a maze of industrial equipment and conveyor belts that had fallen silent for the final time. There, Keisha pointed toward a line of light beneath a door marked Administration. "That's where they'll be." As they approached, voices became audible through the thin walls. Thomas recognized Margaret Sinclair's crisp, professional tone, though there was an edge to it he'd never heard before. "Told you this was getting too complicated. The FBI involvement changes everything." "The FBI has nothing," came another voice, male older, with the gravelly confidence of someone accustomed to buying his way out of problems. "Vincent Morrison. Mitchell's investigation died with him, and the detective is just a small-town cop who stumbled into something bigger than she understands." Thomas and Keisha exchanged glances. Morrison still believed Thomas was dead or captured, which meant their element of surprise was intact. "What about the evidence they collected?" Margaret's voice carried a note of worry. "The recordings, the financial data, will disappear into the federal bureaucracy and be forgotten," Morrison interrupted. "I've been making politicians rich for 30 years, Margaret. A few phone calls, some strategic campaign contributions, and this whole investigation gets buried so deep it'll never see daylight." Thomas felt rage building in his chest, not just at the betrayal, but at the casual arrogance of it. Morrison spoke about destroying lives and communities as if they were nothing more than line items on a balance sheet. "Besides," Morrison continued, "by tomorrow morning, Mitchell Enterprises will be completely liquidated. Every asset stripped, every investment recalled. The small-town projects that were threatening our operations will be bankrupt within the week." "And the people?" Margaret asked. "The workers, the families, are not our problem," Morrison said coldly. "They should have chosen their employers more carefully." That was enough. Thomas stood up, his decision made, but Keisha caught his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "We need more. A confession isn't enough. We need evidence of the murder, the money laundering network, everything." She was right, but Thomas's patience was exhausted. Every minute they waited, more of his assets disappeared into Morrison's offshore accounts, more communities faced destruction. Then inspiration struck. Thomas pulled out his phone, the one he'd revealed in the diner, the one connected to his real identity and resources. With quick fingers, he accessed an app he'd hoped never to use, the emergency liquidation protocol for Mitchell Enterprises. What are you doing? Keisha hissed. Something Morrison won't expect, Thomas whispered back, his fingers flying over the phone screen. He thinks he's stealing my money, but what if there's no money left to steal? He activated the protocol, watching as every legitimate asset of Mitchell Enterprises began transferring into escrow accounts. Accounts Morrison couldn't access, controlled by trustees Thomas had selected years ago for exactly this kind of emergency. Inside the office, an alarm began beeping. Morrison's voice rose in anger. What the hell is that? Sir, we're showing massive asset transfers, came another voice, probably one of Morrison's technical people. Mitchell Enterprises is liquidating everything, but it's not going to our accounts. That's impossible. Mitchell is dead. Not quite, Thomas said, kicking open the office door. The room erupted in chaos. Margaret Sinclair spun around, her face going white as she saw Thomas stride through the doorway. Morrison, a man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice, reached for something under his jacket, but Keisha was faster, her service weapon appearing in her hands with practiced efficiency. Vincent Morrison, you're under arrest for money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and about a dozen federal crimes I'm going to enjoy listing for you, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of 8 years in law enforcement. But Morrison smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd never lost a game that mattered. Detective Washington, isn't it? Chicago PD Financial Crimes. His voice was conversational, almost friendly. Tell me, how is your sister doing these days? Maria, right? Works at that little grocery store in Riverside. Thomas saw Keisha's face go pale, her weapon wavering slightly. Oh yes, Morrison continued, I make it my business to know about the people who interfere with my operations. Maria Washington, age 24, works the evening shift at Garcia's Market on Main Street. Lives alone in that little apartment above the flower shop. Very pretty girl. Very vulnerable. You son of a bitch, Keisha breathed. Language, detective. I'm simply pointing out that you have choices to make. You can continue pointing that gun at me, or you can call your sister and make sure she's safe. But you should probably hurry. My people have very specific instructions about what to do if I don't check in every hour. Thomas felt his world tilt on its axis. Morrison wasn't just threatening Keisha, he was threatening her family. Innocent people who become targets simply because she'd chosen to help a stranger in a diner. But as he watched Keisha's face, he saw something that made his heart swell with admiration. Her weapon never wavered, her stance never shifted. Whatever fear she felt for her sister, she wasn't backing down. Here's the thing, Morrison, she said, her voice steady as granite. You made a mistake when you threatened my family. Because now this isn't about money or businesses or even justice. Now it's personal. She reached into her tactical vest with her free hand, pulling out a small device Thomas didn't recognize. You see, while you were busy threatening innocent people, the FBI was busy tracking your operations. Every call you made tonight, every text message, every electronic communication, it's all been monitored and recorded. Including the conversation we just had about my sister. Morrison's confidence cracked slightly. That's impossible. We use encrypted technology you purchased from a company owned by Mitchell Enterprises, Thomas interrupted, understanding flooding through him. A company I've had backdoor access to for years. Agent Chen's been listening to everything. As if summoned by his words, the building suddenly filled with the sound of vehicles, boots on concrete, shouted orders. Red and blue lights strobed through the windows as the FBI's tactical team surrounded the building. Morrison's face went through a series of expressions, disbelief, rage, and finally, a calculating coldness that made Thomas's skin crawl. Margaret, Morrison said quietly, implement Protocol 7. Margaret Sinclair, who'd been standing frozen throughout the confrontation, suddenly moved with purpose toward a laptop on the desk. Thomas realized with horror what Protocol 7 meant, the final liquidation, not just of his assets but of the evidence, the witnesses, everything that could tie Morrison to his crimes. "Keisha!" Thomas shouted, but she was already moving. The next few seconds stretched into eternity. Margaret's fingers flew over the keyboard, entering commands that would destroy years of evidence and transfer the last of Thomas's legitimate assets to accounts Morrison controlled. Morrison himself was reaching for a weapon hidden beneath his jacket. And through the windows, Thomas could see muzzle flashes in the parking lot, Morrison's security team engaging the FBI. But Keisha Washington, who'd spent 8 months serving coffee and taking orders while building a case against one of the most dangerous criminals in the Midwest, was done playing defense. She tackled Margaret away from a laptop, sending both women crashing into a filing cabinet. At the same moment, Thomas lunged for Morrison, grabbing the older man's wrist as he drew a pistol from his shoulder holster. They struggled for control of the weapon, Morrison's corporate softness no match for the strength Thomas had built in 3 months of manual labor. But Morrison was desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. The gun went off. For a moment, Thomas thought he'd been shot. Then he realized the bullet had gone wide, shattering a window and letting in the cold October air. Morrison was stronger than he looked, fueled by decades of carefully suppressed violence. But Thomas Mitchell had spent the last 6 months learning what it meant to fight for something beyond money, beyond power, beyond his own survival. He was fighting for Keisha, for her sister, for 1,800 workers who deserved better than to be pawns in a criminal's game. He twisted Morrison's wrist until the man cried out, the pistol clattering to the floor. Behind him, he could hear Keisha subduing Margaret with the efficiency of a trained police officer. "It's over," Thomas said, pinning Morrison against the wall as FBI agents poured through the doorway. But Morrison laughed, a sound like broken glass. "You think this ends with me? I've been running this operation for 30 years, boy. Do you really think I don't have contingencies?" Even as Agent Chen's team secured the scene, Morrison's words sent ice through Thomas's veins. The old man was right. Criminal networks didn't die with their leaders. They adapted, evolved, found new hosts like a virus jumping between bodies. "Maybe," Thomas said, "but they'll have to do it without their biggest asset." He pulled out his phone again, showing Morrison the screen. Every account, every shell company, every carefully hidden asset Morrison had built over 3 decades, it was all being transferred to a foundation Thomas had established years ago. A foundation dedicated to supporting the small communities Morrison had spent his life exploiting. "You see, Vincent, while you were busy threatening families and destroying lives, I was busy doing what I do best, managing assets. And as of right now, you don't have any." Morrison's face went purple with rage, but before he could respond, Agent Chun was placing him under arrest, reading him his rights with the satisfaction of someone who'd been chasing this particular ghost for years. As the chaos died down and the criminals were led away, Thomas found himself standing alone with Keisha in the quiet office. Through the broken window, they could see the first hints of dawn painting the horizon. "Is it really over?" Keisha asked, and Thomas heard the exhaustion in her voice, not just from the night's events, but from months of living a lie, of serving coffee while building a case that could have gotten her killed. "The immediate threat is," Thomas said, "Morrison's organization will take years to recover, if it ever does. The money laundering network is blown, the evidence is secure, and your sister." He checked his phone. "Is safe. Agent Chen's people picked her up an hour ago." Relief flooded Keisha's face, and for a moment she looked like she might collapse. Thomas caught her arm, steadying her, and found himself reluctant to let go. "What happens now?" she asked. Thomas looked around the office, at the scattered papers that represented Morrison's criminal empire, at the laptop that had nearly been used to destroy everything he'd built, at the woman beside him who'd risked everything to help a stranger. "Now," he said, "we go home." "Where's that?" Thomas smiled, thinking of a small diner in Riverside, Illinois, where a waitress named Keisha had slipped him a note that changed everything. "I'm thinking somewhere that serves really good coffee," he said, "and has excellent wait staff." 6 months later. The grand reopening of Riverside Manufacturing was nothing like the corporate events Thomas Mitchell had hosted in his previous life. There were no champagne receptions or five-star catering, no silk-tied executives making speeches about synergy and market penetration. Instead, there were folding tables loaded with potluck dishes, a high school marching band playing slightly off-key fight songs, and 1,800 workers who'd gotten their jobs back along with something that had been missing from their lives for far too long: hope. Thomas stood at the edge of the celebration, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that weren't a disguise anymore, watching families reunite with their futures. The Mitchell Foundation had purchased the plant from Morrison's liquidated assets and converted it to an employee-owned cooperative. It would never make him rich, but it would keep this community alive for generations. "You know," Keisha said, appearing beside him with 2 cups of coffee from the refreshment table, "you could have bought yourself a dozen factories with the money you spent saving this one." Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that she'd remembered exactly how he liked it: black, no sugar, like he'd ordered every night for 3 months in a small diner that felt like a lifetime ago. "I had a dozen factories," he replied. "They never felt like this." Keisha was wearing a blue sundress that brought out the gold flecks in her dark eyes, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in the practical ponytail she'd worn as a waitress. She'd officially resigned from the Chicago PD 2 months ago to take a position as the Foundation's Director of Community Outreach, a job that let her use her investigative skills to help people instead of just catching the ones who hurt them. "Any regrets?" she asked, the question they'd been dancing around for months. Thomas considered this seriously. In the past 6 months, he'd given away 90% of his wealth, dismantled a business empire it had taken him 15 years to build, and traded penthouse apartments for a modest house on a tree-lined street in Riverside. He'd gone from being one of the richest men in America to being someone most people had never heard of. "Just one," he said finally. Keisha's face fell slightly. "Oh. I regret," Thomas continued, setting down his coffee and turning to face her fully, "that it took me 43 years to understand what was actually worth fighting for." Her smile could have powered the factory for a week. "And what's that?" she asked, though her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. Thomas reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box that had been burning a hole in his conscience for the past month. "Someone to fight beside," he said, dropping to one knee in front of 1,800 people who'd learned that miracles sometimes wore flannel shirts and served coffee in small-town diners. "Keisha Washington," he said, his voice carrying across the sudden hush that had fallen over the celebration, "will you marry me?" The ring was simple, a single diamond on a platinum band, nothing like the ostentatious displays of wealth he'd once thought were necessary. But as Keisha's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks, Thomas knew he'd finally gotten something exactly right. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "yes." The cheers that erupted from the crowd could probably be heard in the next county. Workers who'd been strangers 6 months ago embraced like family. Children who'd been facing uncertain futures ran through the celebration like they owned the world. And in the middle of it all, Thomas Mitchell, billionaire, construction worker, investigator, and now fiancé, kissed the woman who'd taught him that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought, only earned through courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to risk everything for someone else. As the sun set over Riverside, Illinois, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. He'd started with billions and ended with something infinitely more precious, a community that had become family, a purpose that gave meaning to his days, and a love that had transformed him from the inside out. What's the most valuable thing you've ever discovered when you weren't looking for it? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear how unexpected moments changed your life. Vincent Morrison was serving 25 to life in federal prison, his criminal network dismantled and his assets redistributed to the communities he'd spent decades exploiting. Margaret Sinclair had cooperated with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing evidence that led to the arrests of dozens of co-conspirators across the Midwest. But perhaps most importantly, 1,800 families had learned that sometimes, when the world seems determined to crush your dreams, help can come from the most unexpected places, like a stranger in a diner who turns out to be exactly what you need, exactly when you need it most. As Thomas and Keisha walked hand in hand toward their future, surrounded by friends who become family and a community that had become home, one thing was crystal clear. Some stories end with a hero riding off into the sunset alone. But the best stories end with the hero discovering that the real treasure was the family they found along the way. And in a small town in Illinois, where a diner still served the best coffee for miles around, that's exactly what had happened.